The next poem is called Tissue by Imtiaz Dharker, and it offers a new perspective on the structures of power, using tissue, or paper and its various forms, as a metaphor to explore human life as simultaneously fragile and powerful. In the past, some of my students have found this poem a bit intimidating because it initially seems somewhat cryptic and obscure, and by that I mean difficult to interpret. What I would always say to them, however, and what I would say to you, is to change how you see it. A poem with a more obscure, ambiguous meaning or message, in a way, gives us, as the reader, more freedom with our interpretation. As long as we can justify the interpretation we draw, then in a way we have more liberty with that interpretation than when approaching a poem with a crystal clear message and meaning that leaves a more constricted reading. So bear that in mind as we go over this poem, that it is an opportunity to explore your interpretation with a bit more freedom. We'll read the poem and discuss what it's about, we'll annotate it together and think about which other poems you could compare it to in the anthology. Paper that lets the light shine through. This is what could alter things. Paper thinned by age or touching, the kind you find in well-used books, the back of the Quran, where a hand has written in the names and histories, who was born to whom, the height and weight, who died where and how, on which sepia date, pages smoothed and stroked and turned transparent with attention. If buildings were paper, I might feel their drift, see how easily they fall away on a sigh, a shift in the direction of the wind. Maps too. The sun shines through their borderlines, the marks that rivers make, roads, rail tracks, mountain folds. Fine slips from grocery shops that say how much was sold and what was paid by credit card might fly our lives like paper kites. An architect could use all this, place layer over layer, luminous script over numbers over line, and never wish to build again with brick or block, but let the daylight break through capitals and monoliths, through the shapes that pride can make, find a way to trace a grand design with living tissue, raise a structure never meant to last, of paper smoothed and stroked and thinned to be transparent, turned into your skin. What's the overview of this poem? As discussed, it doesn't have a particularly distinct narrative plot in the way that some of the other poems in the collection do. A brilliant word to describe this poem would be a palimpsest, because it has many layers and levels of meaning that build on from one another, but we'll discuss that more when annotating it. This poem begins by discussing very thin paper, paper that lets the light shine through, as it says, and relates that to the thin paper of religious texts and the power that those can wield. As the poem develops, it becomes clear that this poem is a metaphor, and the metaphor extends to include maps and buildings made of paper and even receipts and money. It's suggested that once an architect uses paper with all the richness of its associations, how it allows humans to make records from arts and culture to the sciences, the architect would never want to use brick again, because brick isn't as powerful. And finally, when it describes a structure never meant to last, and compares that to human tissue, skin, it becomes apparent that this metaphor extends to human life, and the paradox of how things that are delicate can also be powerful. This poem is part of a collection called The Terrorist at My Table by Imtiaz Dharker, which was published in 2006 and explores global politics, religion, and extremism or fundamentalism. As the first poem in the collection, we can regard tissue as an introduction to these topics and expect it to contain a message about power and the abuses of power. Dharker was born in Pakistan, but she grew up in Scotland. Much of her poetry concentrates on identity and the search for identity and meaning, as well as other complex issues like religion and global politics. Her poems often contain multiple interpretations, which seems appropriate since there's never a single perspective in such intricate and multifaceted issues. Let's take a closer look at the poem. First, let's consider the title. Like many of the poems in this collection, we can draw different interpretations from this title. Obviously, the first thing that comes to mind when we think of tissue is very thin paper, the sort that comes in a box. But then you think about what other things are made of paper or very thin paper. You have the pages of religious texts or very heavy tomes, very heavy books have that really thin paper so thin it's almost transparent. There are other types of paper. There are books, magazines. Another key one, you have receipts and money that will come into this poem. And then obviously there's another connotation, there's living tissue, human skin, and the title references that as we see later in the poem. So this first stanza, paper that lets the light shine through, this is what could alter things. It's quite a cryptic, ambiguous opening. It's an opening that is difficult to interpret. What things could be altered and in what way? It seems deliberately cryptic because things is a very unspecific noun. This light shining through, there must be a symbolic undertone to that. What are the connotations of light? Truth? Truth is often conveyed as a symbolic beacon of light. Hope? And if, as later is suggested, the paper metaphor extends to human life, could this be alluding to our skin thinning? Our skin thins with age, and yet when something is thinner, the light shines through. Does that mean wisdom? We grow wiser as we age? That could be one interpretation. See if you can think of another. You just need to be able to justify it. And this very thin paper, the kind you find in well-used books, thinned by touching, there's a delicacy to this paper. And if something is delicate, it is fragile. But as we'll see through the poem, just because something seems fragile, there can be a simultaneous power and strength there too. Where a hand has written in the names and histories who was born to whom, later we'll see more of this. It's this question of what can paper record? And here, in the back of a religious book that has been passed down through generations, which often happens with these religious texts, you have a family history memorialized by paper. So even this thin, delicate paper, it outlives us as humans, and that's a reminder there how. The height and weight, who died where and how, on which sepia date. Sepia, if you know what sepia is, it's that brown quality of an old photo. It's something I think we've lost in the digital age and the age of coloured photo, that there was something really magical when you look back at old film photography. Perhaps you have this when you see pictures of your grandparents or even your great-grandparents, when the photo is in black and white or is in this sepia, these tones of brown. And it feels like you're looking back at another world. This word, definitely, it creates a sense of nostalgia. What is memorialized by paper? So we have this reminder of the transience of life. And by transience, I mean the fleeting nature of life, that the paper that we record things on can outlive us. And throughout, a common theme that we'll keep coming back to again and again is this idea of permanence. What is fixed and remains and is permanent versus impermanence. The permanence of a record and of a photo versus the impermanence of life. The permanence of a building versus the impermanence of paper that can be torn up or can drift away. Notice, we'll keep coming back to this theme again and again throughout the poem. We'll talk more about structure later. You've probably noticed that we have these 4-line stanzas, what we call quatrains, which will run throughout until you get to that final single-line stanza at the end. And in terms of rhyme, there isn't a regular rhyme scheme, but every now and then you come across what we call internal rhyme, which is when the words that rhyme are in the middle rather than the end of a line. For example, kind and find, wait and date, drift and shift, to and through. And why? Well, perhaps just as the meaning within this poem isn't in the place we expect, nor is the rhyme. So the internal rhyme reflects that. This next stanza comes to it again. Permanence versus impermanence. Paper record compared to a human life is permanent, but paper compared to building and brick, there's an impermanence there. This idea, as I said, of permanence versus impermanence is woven throughout the poem. And we move on to something else written by man and recorded on paper, and that's maps too. That's highlighted because it's followed by that full stop, that caesura, that break in the line of poetry. The sun shines through their borderlines. You can have different interpretations of that, but in terms of this light, it's a recurring theme again from the paper that lets the light shine through in the first stanza. Perhaps this light that shines through also changes things. But this time, it's the sun shining through borderlines. the lines dividing countries that human beings mark on maps. And for me, it's raising the question, what really are these borders and who creates them? These borders separating countries that can cause such division and so much conflict. Who decides where those borders are and what are they really? They're not a physical line in the ground itself. They're only marked by physical lines on maps. And as she says, the sun can shine through them. The sun can perhaps dispel them. But it makes us question, what are these things, these lines that divide countries and potentially cause conflict? And we continue this idea of maps, the marks that rivers make, roads, rail tracks, mountain folds. What do you notice about these four? Perhaps you'll notice more if I colour coordinate them. These geographical things that the lines on the map indicate, the natural entities, the rivers and the mountains, they sandwich or they surround the man-made things, the roads and the rail tracks. So the natural surrounds the unnatural. If we were going to mark that out, and the natural things are A and the man-made things are B, it would go A, B, B, A. That is what we call, a fancy poetic term now, a chiasmus or a chiastic arrangement. And it's when you have this structure, when the first two concepts are repeated in reverse order. Or, put more simply, two concepts sandwiching another two in the middle. A famous example of a chiasmus in rhetoric would be something John F. Kennedy said, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Country, you, country. A, B, B, A. That is a chiasmus or a chiastic arrangement. As always, it is not enough to spot these methods. We must then discuss the effect of the methods. So, why have this chiasmus? Why have the natural surrounding or encompassing the man-made? What does that highlight? Is it to show the permanence of what is natural as opposed to things that are built, like railroads that can be more easily derailed? Roads need to be maintained, resurfaced. Mountains don't. One reading could be that it draws attention to the superiority of natural over unnatural. Find slips from grocery shops that say how much was sold. The next stanza moves on to receipts and money. So in terms of our different forms of tissue, we've had the thin paper of religious texts, the paper record of family history. We've had the comparison to buildings made of paper, maps, and now we come to another construction of mankind, which is money. And definitely in this stanza, there is a criticism that money controls our lives, but it shouldn't. What was paid by credit card might fly our lives like paper kites. This is a topical simile because it continues that theme of paper. But what does this simile do? It certainly points out and criticises money's power over us, that money flies us in the way that we fly paper kites. But what else? Remember, the strongest answers that get into level 5, level 6, they offer multiple interpretations or layers of interpretation. So what else does this simile do? It also illustrates how precarious our economic structure is, that it leaves us, when we're controlled by money, and money unfortunately does make the world go round, our society is dictated by money, as uncomfortable as that truth is, it leaves us as vulnerable as a flimsy paper kite tumbling and being buffeted in the wind. The simile shows how it leaves us vulnerable, this society that depends so heavily on money, on these receipts, this construct that traces back to paper. An architect could use all this, place layer over layer, luminous script over numbers over line, and never wish to build again with brick. The word that screams out at me when I read this stanza, and actually the word that also sounds when I'm reading the poem itself, is this word I mentioned earlier, palimpsest, palimpsest. Because a palimpsest is both an old text in which writing is layered and new writing replaces old writing, but it's also a work of art that has layers or levels of meaning that build. And that is exactly what this poem is. This stanza refers explicitly to a physical palimpsest of text, layers and layers of luminous script over numbers over line, so this layering of manuscript over manuscript, but also that other tier, that the whole poem has many layers and levels of different meanings. This term encapsulates the whole poem, really. It is all a palimpsest. An architect would use all this and never wish to build again with brick. So what is it saying here? Again, you can have different interpretations, but for me, all of this, all of the layers of luminous script over numbers over line. So text and numbers and literature and mathematics is more powerful and permanent than brick. So this refers to literacy and numeracy, and all that encompasses art, intellect, culture, mathematics and science, all of what is recorded on paper, all of what education or man's developing intelligence entails, being able to write things down, being able to record things for posterity. What all of that contributes to is more powerful and more metaphorically solid than brick. And this is why the poem offers multiple interpretations. That something like paper is fragile, but it can also wield more power than something that is concrete and hard. Daylight breaking through again, this motif of light shining through in the poem. And now you have daylight breaking through physical buildings, capitals and monoliths, a massive structure. The daylight breaks through those things even though they're solid. The shapes that pride can make, this must refer to humans' hubris, man's arrogance. Shapes that pride can make. I see Ozymandias in that line, creating a statue that says, "Look on my works, you mighty in despair." Human arrogance and the problematic shapes that can make as well. Find a way to trace a grand design. We come to the crux of the poem, living tissue, and raise a structure never meant to last. This is showing us that the paper metaphor extends to human life, and the poet or speaker has saved this final connotation until last. This living tissue, human skin, which she explicitly refers to in the final line. In fact, it's the final word of the poem. Skin. A structure never meant to last, that reminds us that humans are mortal. We're not meant to last. We live and we die. But still, despite our fragility, despite our mortality, there's power there as well because we have created this. It can be read in both ways because, as we said, there are many different layers to this text. You have on one side the negative aspects of human beings, the pride and arrogance of humans, and us dividing people with borders and societies that are built on money. But also, we have all the art and culture and sciences and the passing down of history, and all of that is inextricably linked as one. But it all means that our lives, although fleeting and flawed, have meaning. We have created meaning with our legacy. And then this final line, you've had those other 4-line stanzas throughout, those quatrains, but the 10th is a single line stanza. And that makes it really stand out. That is the poet making it clear how important this final line is, because it stands so isolated and so distinct from the other stanzas of the poem. She is drawing our attention to this final line through the layout of the page. Turned into your skin. The poem's first use of second person, you. This first direct address that is urging us to use the poem's message to reflect on our own lives. This poem applies to us, to everyone, and that direct address is elucidating that. The direct address speaking directly to the reader or listener. And that final stanza reinforces what we suspected earlier, that this metaphor of paper does extend to human life. And she ends on that. She leaves us with that as the final message. The poem has a consistent structure on the whole, comprising 10 stanzas, 9 of which are 4-line stanzas or quatrains. But it makes that final, isolated, single-line stanza, that one line, turned into your skin, really stand out, which Dharker would have done for a reason, because it tells the reader that the poem is directly relevant to us and what shapes our lives. The poem doesn't, however, have a consistent rhyme scheme or meter, and so it's what we call free verse. In fact, any rhyme within it often comes from internal rhyme, which is when the words rhyming aren't at the end of the line but in the middle. This and the flowing of the free verse in a way subverts the consistent structure of the quatrains, but that feels fitting in a poem with so many layers. For comparisons, you could compare this poem to London, because both explore power as the root of suffering and both criticise material wealth. Dharker, however, unlike Blake, offers a solution that we shouldn't let material wealth control us or fly our lives like a paper kite. You could also compare it to Ozymandias or the Prelude, since all address or explore the fragility of mankind and man's power. I hope this helped you understand the poem better. If you still come away from that poem after the first, or even the 7th or 8th reading thinking, still not quite sure what it's about, don't worry, that's almost the point. As I said, it's meant to offer different interpretations and perspectives. It is, ultimately, to use that word again, a palimpsest, containing many layers of meaning.